Karen Matzo here again for your fourth webinar in our New Hampshire Charter Schools webinar series, and this is Restorative Practices in Schools, Part 2. Welcome. There I am again. And I'm just giving you a little reminder of the 5 R's of restorative practices that we talked about in Part 1. Repair, respect, responsibility, relationship, and reintegration. And this is familiar to you. We talk about repair, repairing the harm that's done, reintegrating individuals or an individual or individuals into the community rather than isolating them, using relationships to heal, and building relationships through conflict and mutual respect and taking responsibility for our involvement. And in our last webinar, we talked about community agreements and community circles on the continuum of restorative practices. And now we'll talk about cognitive reframing, and then we'll move to restorative conversations and restorative circles. So cognitive reframing is a tool that you use when you're having conversations with colleagues, with your real life people, with students. And the goal is to help people to reframe, right? So it helps with overgeneralizations and assumptions. So if something, just as an example, a student comes to you and says that um, a person in the class didn't want to sit with them at lunchtime. And, maybe that student says something like, they always do that, right? And it makes the assumption that it happens once, right? So it's going to happen again. And there could be reality to it, but the reframe, right, might be that it's not going to happen again. Okay. And so, or for, bullet 2, reframing encourages a person not to take someone else's actions toward them or even not toward them personally, right? It's this idea that everybody sort of stays on their side of the river and doesn't let other people's stuff, what is probably someone else's mood, right, impact them. So, here's an example of they didn't pick me as a partner, and therefore that person may not like me. Okay. Or because Mrs. Smith is grumpy, she doesn't like me. Okay. So then the reframe is basically, maybe Mrs. Smith is having a bad day. And maybe they didn't pick you as a partner because today they picked somebody else as a partner, but it probably has nothing to do with whether they like you or don't like you. And last, reframing helps to build empathy and perspective, right? How might it feel from that person's lens? Right before we take it in personally, can we be empathetic and think about what might be happening for the other person? What kind of events may have happened prior to the event that's being discussed? What kind of worldview or frame, to steal a little from some previous webinars. What is that person's worldview? Why is that person's worldview or day frame the way it is? And how might considering their perspective help a student or whoever take a different perspective or see something differently? So here's some good reframing questions. What happened? Okay. So the new girl came to school and gave me a rude look, right? You might be talking to a student. Okay. And you might say to the student, well, what are you feeling? I'm feeling offended and rejected. Okay. It'd be great if you could get your students to say that and to identify and name those feelings. What assumption are you making? Well, I'm assuming she doesn't like me. What else might be going on, do you think? Do you have any ideas? And, you're going to lead the student to the point where help her understand that the new girl may be feeling very, very vulnerable and may have her defenses up because she doesn't know anybody. And then the question to the student might be, how have your feelings changed based on this conversation or based on this new thinking of yours? And you help a student get to the place where they feel less angry and a little more sympathetic or empathetic. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 questions here to use in cognitive reframing. Here's some examples for helpful reframing that you can help students with, you can help colleagues with. Okay. The first one is mind reader mode. Okay. Thinking that you know what someone is thinking. And there's an example. Well, she didn't laugh at my joke. She doesn't think I'm funny at all. And then the reframe is, okay, maybe she didn't like that joke. Maybe she's heard the joke before. Maybe she has a different sense of humor, and isn't that okay? So the next one is ignoring the positive mode. And this is a really frequent one. When you or a student or a colleague, you're filtering things in a way so that only the bad things seem to resonate or matter. And so you have in the middle column, it doesn't matter I got chosen for a part in the play. I didn't get the lead role. Okay. So here's a different reframe. I didn't get the lead role in the play, and I was the first choice for the role that I did get. Okay. So helping students and colleagues and friends sort of see the positive alongside. Fortune teller mode. This is catastrophizing or predicting the worst future outcome. And this, I think we've seen with kids a lot. I haven't made any friends yet. I'm never going to make any friends in my whole life. Okay. And the reframe might be right now, I'm still working on making friends and I'm going to keep trying. And, you might help a student to reframe that. Okay. Here's the everything is my fault mode. When you're sure that everything is always your fault, it always comes back to you. Okay. And my teacher punished the whole class, and it's probably because I was too loud. It's actually sort of an unlikely example, now that I think about it. That'd be an amazing sense of self-analysis there. Um, it's usually something different than that. And then here's the reframe. You probably weren't the only person being loud in the whole class. All right. So it's not just you. Um, I must mode. That's where you take on very rigid roles about what you have to do. Okay. And so this middle one says to be a good friend, I always have to be fun. I can't ever be in a bad mood, right? Or I always have to be generous, or I always have to put somebody else's needs before mine. Those are some assumptions that are and helpful. Reframe is everybody gets in a bad mood sometimes, and that doesn't mean that you're a bad friend. You're just a human being. And the just a human being reframe is a good one. Um, the all or nothing mode, black and white, no room for gray. Um, and the reframe here is maybe, okay, this particular student was just having a bad day. Maybe good kids can also make mistakes. All right. Maybe the teacher was being unfair. Right. So these are just some examples of helpful reframing for students, for adults. And when you're having a restorative conversation, reframing is a great strategy to use. So, restorative conversations are conversations that are small and controlled, and that's why they're to the left of community conversations or community problem solving on that continuum. These restorative conversations, they're brief, they can be one-on-one or a triad. They are self-reflective and solution focused. They address behaviors before behaviors escalate, and they simply support students in getting back to learning. And whatever happens may not be fixed in a single conversation, which is just okay. So, restorative conversations can be used when one or two students has a conflict or a problem. Example, argument between students, when a student is disrespectful to a teacher, when a student is refusing to do work or cutting class or violating school property or disrupting lessons, right? And we don't want to have these conversations in public. We want them to be private, out of the view of other students. Before having a restorative conversation, think about the individual's emotional state and your own emotional state, right? Think about that flip your lid video. And am I in a heightened state with cortisol coursing through my body? Is the student in a heightened state? Because good communication does not happen when two people are in that heightened state. And the third bullet's important. You want to use affective language, which is language of emotions. And you want to use cognitive reframing. You want to ask open-ended questions, okay? Tell me more about what happened with you and Mrs. Smith. Tell me more about what happened at lunch today between you and Abby. How did you feel about that? What were you thinking, right? Those sorts of open-ended questions. You definitely want to set the tone and establish safety. And I think when necessary, you also want to establish some confidentiality if that's needed. You want to de-escalate emotions and create a safe environment. And this is just a little script for you, right? Just in case you need it, because we're teachers. Sometimes we feel like we need to be therapists, but we're teachers. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I want to have a quick check-in, just a 5 or 10 minute conversation so I can understand your perspective. So we're conveying to the student, I'm talking to you so I can understand, and it has to be authentic. You actually authentically need to reflect for that student that you're seeking to understand so that we can both move forward in a good way. You want to establish some common ground, and this is optional, but recommended. Start with a positive message to prevent the student getting defensive. So before we talk about what happened, I want to say I really appreciate your work on blah, blah, blah. Um, what's working well for you in our class lately? Now, the thing that you want to be careful of, obviously, which you may be thinking is, um, conveying any sort of ingenuineness, like kids kids have a really kids and adults and many people have a super 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 sensitive radar for inauthenticity or ingenuineness from an adult. So if you think that establishing that common ground is not going to work with a particular student, or you take a pot shot at a pot, not in a negative way, but you like take an air ball out at establishing common ground, and it compromises the genuine feeling in the conversation. Just be aware of that. You want to be careful about those positive statements before you start talking. All right. The next part of the conversation is to gather the story. So you're going to ask some open-ended questions. You want to make sure you don't trigger shame or blame. Open-ended, tell me about what happened from your point of view. What were you thinking at the time? How did you feel? And what were you hoping would happen? All open-ended, really useful and pointed questions. Then explore the impact. Who was affected? So you're going to build empathy between the people, right? That had the conflict, and you're going to encourage self-awareness in each of the participants. So, who do you think has been affected by this? Or how has blank been affected by this, right? If you would already know. Um, how do you think your words and actions made blank feel? You know, and then we have the repair stage of the restorative conversation. This is where you're holding a student accountable for solutions. Okay, the forced insincere apology is going to be useless. So, what do you think you need to do to make things right? How can you make things right? If this happens again, what will you do differently? Sometimes it's hard to formulate these open-ended questions that will sort of move the conversation in the direction that it needs to go in and gather the information needed. So I actually, it seems obvious, but I very much like this script. And then you're going to reach an agreement, solidify a clear plan to maintain the relationship between you and whoever, between two students or adults. Or so the adult script is what are we going to agree on? Um, what does moving forward look like? When would be a good time for me to check in with you, an individual, or both of you later this week to see how it's going? Sometimes it's hard to have conversations in schools because it's a busy day. And these are some examples of when you might be able to. During independent work or when groups are working together, you can grab a student for 5 minutes. During their recess, you can go out on the playground and grab a student for 5 minutes. During their lunch, I'm gonna be honest, sometimes I would just invite a student to have lunch with me. It's such a privilege for some students, and that might be a really nice time for them. Not all the time because we need our space, but I think it's sort of lovely. In between classes is reasonable, as long as you can give a student a pass if they're going to another class and they'll be late. The regulation space, like if you have a teaching assistant in the classroom or a paraprofessional for 5 minutes, you can take a student into a regulation space. And the hallways, okay if it's mostly empty, but you need to be aware of the people around you. All right, restorative circles. So restorative circles are sort of restorative conversations, but expanded. And it's for a community mostly. So it could be a small group, it could be a larger group, it could be your whole class, and they can be used to manage challenging conflict within that community or challenging dynamics. And those are just a list of some of the dynamics that you might see, right? Like kids are coming back to class late, kids are calling out, maybe a couple of kids are making inappropriate jokes, or maybe a student is singling out another student. Okay. Now, participation is encouraged but not required. What I have done and seen done is that you can call a restorative circle, and anyone who doesn't want to participate, if it's like a whole class, they can sit outside the circle and listen, right? Um, but you cannot, within the sort of spirit of a restorative circle, you can't force participation. Now, you can make having a restorative circle or a restorative conversation, um, you can use that and make sort of that contingent on not having a more negative or punishing consequence. All right. So that's kind of a lever that you could use to encourage because something has to happen, right? If there's a conflict or someone has been harmed, something has to happen in response to it. And so I sometimes I would invite a restorative conversation as opposed to, missing recess or okay, you need a space, a circle where the students present can take place, and then you need a talking piece, and likely you will be the facilitator to move conversation forward. You're going to, it's very much like a community circle, except you're problem solving. Invite students to circle and get grounded. Again, you're going to review the agreements and check on the members, right? You might do a quick fist of five. Fist is I'm really in a horrible mood. Five, I'm in a great mood. Or fist is I'm really not ready to talk about this. Five is I feel ready to talk about this. Um, Establish purpose and impact. So you're going to, as the facilitator, talk about why you're gathering. You are going to facilitate conversation around students' experiences related to a particular problem or event and help them to express their thoughts and feelings. Then you want to generate options for repair or improvement or growth. Share strengths and successes, ask how we can make this right. You are going to hopefully be able to work towards consensus in terms of a solution. Okay. So if three or four kids are yelling out in class and the rest of the class can't concentrate, you will generate a solution with the group. You will have a consensus vote on the solution. And if some kids agree and some kids don't, you'll keep talking about it. Okay. And sometimes, again, I'm big into fist to five. So consensus means when I do consensus work, it's I'm trying to get the group to agree to a three or over, right? So a zero is I absolutely can't go along with this. One is I hear you and I can keep talking about it. Two is I'm close, but I have some reservations. Three is I can go along with the group on this. Four is yes, with some, minor worries. And five is I'm all the way in. Okay. So that's a nice way to do consensus in a group. And then you close and appreciate everybody's participation. So here are some examples of agreements. So respecting the talking piece, you can see that one person speaks, all right, and everyone else is listening. And you can model with students, what does it look like to practice deep listening? Eye contact, obviously no phones, looking at each other, sort of being still, trying not to tap. If a student needs a fidget, fine. Speak and listen from the heart. That's a great one. Speak with an I voice, share your genuine experience, and listen to others with the goal of non-judgment. And try to keep your own rebuttal out of your head. Confidentiality, I had mentioned that earlier. What is shared in the circle stays in the circle. Step up, step back. And what this means is don't dominate the circle, right? Be mindful of your airtime and encourage quieter voices. Elicit, if you can teach students this to elicit input from their quieter peers, it's an incredible skill. You're allowed to pass, you don't have to speak. And you want to focus, this is an interesting one, on impact, not intent. So the statement of, you know, I meant it this way. If one of the conversations that you're having in a circle has to do with something that hurts somebody's feelings, and then the person who said the negative statement or the perceived negative statement might say, but I never meant to hurt their feelings, right? So, okay. And yet the impact was negative. So let's talk about that. So you want to focus on impact, not intent. We've seen this before. It's all in shared values, okay? We want to have our circle agreements and they're grounded in the norms that we want to see. Now, big no's oftentimes could be events that are discussed in circle. So restorative circles for big no's. And I just want to say they can be used, and this could also be a conversation between victim and offender, right? And those are just some examples of some big no's. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to use the circle to assign blame and punishment, okay? Again, we are focused on repairing harm, taking responsibility and repairing harm. It's important to remember. Unless, of course, there are policies by the school district, and actually not unless, along with the implementations of school district policies. So this is just a little contrast chart. Punitive practice versus restorative practice in addressing big no's. Punitive practices ask about blame and punishment. Restorative practices ask for responsibility and repair. Punitive asks about the rule or law that was broken, whereas restorative practices ask about the harm that was caused. Punitive practices speak to who broke it. Restorative practices ask what are the needs and obligations of all affected by the harm and what punishment is deserved is punitive, whereas how can all affected parties create a plan to heal the harm as soon as possible. There are some necessary conditions if you're going to have a restorative circle when you're talking about high stakes, big no's. Before you can have the circle, the offender or the person that's perpetrated harm has to be able to accept responsibility. You have nowhere to start in the conversation unless they can accept responsibility. It's important that you don't arrange or try to facilitate a restorative circle with the offender there if he or she or they has not accepted responsibility. The victim and the offender both have to be willing to participate. Victim and offender have to feel safe. They have to consider it safe to be involved in the process. And it's realistic that a victim and an offender may not feel entirely safe, and you won't have a restorative circle for that big no. Okay? And some other type of process will have to happen. I would not try to implement restorative circles unless you have a restorative culture at your school. That's why we had that continuum. And the pieces before the restorative circles need to be built before you can engage in restorative circles in your school community. And when we say tier one practices, that means that every classroom has agreements, right? Every classroom has, a morning meeting or a community circle meeting, right? Those are some tier one practices that need to be in place. And then, all I'm saying here is that it would be great if you are the facilitator of restorative circles with big no's, some additional facilitation skills might be needed. You want to be ready. Because with high stakes stuff, things can go awry. Okay. We're going to watch just a little bit of this. It's a terrific example, and but it's 6 minutes long. But I'm going to give you a taster, and then I'll shut it down. And you know that you have the slides that go along with this webinar, so you can access it on your own.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to thank you both for coming in to talk to me and one another. Today, we're going to take in both of your perspectives on what happened and to think about the impact that it had on you and others, and to actively listen to one another so we can reach a solution on how to make things right. Does that sound good?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All right. So, as a reminder, the group norms for our conversation here in this circle are speak from the heart, listen from the heart. Personal information shared stays between us in this circle. Take the time you need and take care of yourself. Can we agree to that? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. So we're here to discuss the argument that occurred in Mr. Bondano's classroom. First, I'm going to ask Mr. Bondano a set of questions, and then I will move on to Steve and ask him a set of questions. And then we're going to come together to determine what we want to do to make things right. Does that sound okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So I'm going to start with Mr. Bondano. All right. All right. Thank you. So, Mr. Badano, what happened?
We got into a bit of an argument in my classroom. Steve was trying to turn in some work after my deadline that is a deadline he knew about, had been communicated with him. Um, I felt like he was kind of ambushing me with it, trying to get me to grade it because he wanted it on the report card to raise his grade. We would have the discussion. I lost my temper. He lost his, and we got into an argument.
What were you thinking at the time?
I was feeling pretty disrespected. I'd been clear about that deadline. I've been doing my best to communicate it. And Steve had told me before that that wasn't
There's a district
Dave,
timeline.
we agreed to the norms, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so we're going to listen attentively and show each other respect, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, loosen up a little. Okay, you may continue.
Thank you. I was feeling, like I said, kind of ambushed and disrespected by it. And I fully acknowledge I should not have lost my temper back at him. And that was my mistake on that.
Okay. What were you feeling that led you to that?
Uh, I think I give a lot of grace and a lot of notice in my classroom, and he knows how important time management is. And he's talking about this other deadline that isn't the one that's in the syllabus that he was aware of. So I was feeling like we'd had this conversation before.
Gotcha. What have you thought about since this incident happened?
I've thought about maybe how I could be more clear in my communication about these deadlines, and I've also, of course, thought about how I could have taken that moment in the moment to breathe and not lose my temper.
So, how do you feel about it right now?
I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I think it's a good thing. I wish it wasn't taking away time from all the other things we have to do, especially with the grading deadline approaching. But I'm glad that we're here having the conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing. Right, Steve. All right. So, what were you thinking at the time when you realized what happened?
I was thinking that Mr. Rondano didn't accept my work because he just simply didn't like me, because I turned in my work adhering to the district's deadline, but he has his own grading policy. So there was a problem in between that.
So, how did that make you feel?
It made me feel very disrespected. It made me feel like he wasn't listening to me. I have a lot of stuff going on at home too, on top of my classes. So when I did all of my homework at home and stuff like that, I took time away from my other things, my other responsibilities. And then when it wasn't graded, I just feel like I just wasted my time.
So, what effect do you believe this incident had on others and yourself, of course?
Well, now I can't have my grades in on time and have a good report card. And also, I heard a couple of other students talking about the same thing of how Mr. Mondano did not accept their work.
How do you feel about it right now?
I feel like this conversation was needed, and I'm glad that we can talk about this and find a solution.
Thank you so much for sharing. So, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. You guys okay with that? Mr. Mondano?
Okay, I'm gonna keep going just because it's a pretty long one. But it's really interesting and sort of beautiful to hear, well, to hear a student and a teacher being facilitated by another teacher. I
What
think
do you
it's really
think?
great. I can't, whoops. Ah! Whoop. Sorry. Um, I'm going to let you know that there is some really good resources here for you. So here are some background resources on restorative justice. And some of this is like, for example, that's the research study of the Oakland Unified School District that I referred to earlier, mindful schools, restorative solutions. This is all 9 criticisms. Okay, so you might want to read about that too. Just some background, and here's some information on bullying. Okay, definitions and how to support with restorative practices in bullying situations. Here's some of the data that supports the need for restorative practices from the civil rights data collection and exclusionary discipline. And this is a great book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. I recommend it to everybody. It's a really wonderful book, and this is an interesting one by Dan Reisel, The Neuroscience of Restorative Justice. Um, Community and restorative circle examples. Some of this was in a previous in webinar number one, but here is some info on cognitive reframing, and this is a worksheet. Okay, that you can use, that we've used in workshops if you want to teach this in your school setting to other adults. Okay, these are just some different, this is a one particular scenario that is useful to practice for restorative circles, student voice. Here's an example for large circle, and this is the last one is re-entry, like having a um, per perpetrator or someone that caused harm re-enter the community. And there is our contact information of demonstrated success, and there is my contact information. Um, and get in touch if you want any more professional development or if you have any questions or you need any more resources. Thank you. Take care.